Welcome back to Unlimited Recaps. Today we'll be diving into a family drama film from 2006 titled The Pursuit of Happiness. In 1981, the movie opened in San Francisco. Chris Gardner, the movie's protagonist, makes a living by marketing medical equipment. He drops his son Christopher off at daycare every day and then makes his way to other hospitals that could be interested in buying what he's selling. The issue, as Chris describes it, is that almost all hospitals view the device as costly and unneeded, even though he needs to sell at least one every month to make ends meet. This means that even though Linda works 2 shifts, he has to ask her to pick up their son from the daycare. Chris notices a Rubik's Cube that evening while eating dinner. It was still a brand new toy. Before returning to work, Chris tells Linda that he needs to file for another extension after she asks him whether he has already paid the taxes. This makes Linda even more anxious. Chris attempts to solve the Rubik's Cube after Linda leaves, but he finds it to be very simple. Walking down the street the next day, Chris spots a businessman driving a gorgeous automobile. The man replies that he is a stockbroker when Chris asks what he does for a living. Chris remarks that a high school degree is necessary for the work, to which the man replies that it is not because one needs simply rely on math and social skills. Following their brief exchange, Chris tells how pleased everyone is around him and wonders why he isn't feeling the same way. The following morning, Chris informs Linda that he will be applying to be a stockbroker and that he will be returning home at 6. Chris feels that Linda finds it absurd, which is a complaint. After an argument, Linda tells Chris they still owe for 2 months' rent. Chris then goes to apply at a brokerage firm. But Chris doesn't want to walk inside carrying his medical equipment, so he leaves it with a street performer. Chris refers to this aspect of his life as being stupid as he completes his application for the job. He notices that the street performer is escaping with the device from behind the employer. This prompts Chris to hastily go while carrying the application. Nevertheless, the street entertainer escapes by train. Chris tells Linda the next day that he will sell the gadget so she won't be able to see it. Chris informs him that, in contrast to what is written on the daycare walls, the word happiness does not contain Y when he delivers Christopher to the daycare. He then shares with his kid the origin of his moniker 10-gallon head, which comes from Texas, where people are known for their big cowboy hats. After that, Chris goes to Dean Witter Reynolds with an application that has been completed and delivers it in person to Jay Twistle, Dean Witter's resource of D. But Jay is rushing, so their conversation is short. Chris witnesses the street performer and her accomplice carrying the stolen device after dropping off the application form. Chris follows after them furiously, telling them that he has spent his entire life savings on it and that one lost is worth a month's worth of groceries. He chases the two and eventually recovers his device. His earlier pledge that he would get rid of it is no longer true. The issue is that he now owns 2 gadgets. Sure enough, Linda discovers the 2 gadgets later that day and is really let down. Chris tells Linda about what happened earlier after giving their son a basketball for his birthday, but Linda is not interested in hearing it. In the subsequent scene, Chris converses with Jay as he calls for a cab. Jay tells him he has to go elsewhere, but Chris informs him about the application that he submitted a month ago. Chris then uses this as an opportunity to introduce himself to Jay by letting him know that he would be meeting there. They ride in the same taxi as a result. Jay is concentrating on solving the Rubik's Cube inside the taxi as Chris is discussing his abilities and character. When Chris offers to solve the cube after noticing this, Jay doesn't think he's serious. But Chris impresses Jay by finishing the cube right before he nods off. But he leaves Chris behind, so Chris has to pay the price now. Chris successfully flees by train after stopping at a stoplight, but he forgets his device as the train door closes on his hand. That day, Chris apologizes over the phone to Linda. Linda, who is upset over missing her shift, informs Chris that she and Christopher are going to be departing. Chris returns home to discover that his wife and son have left. But at that very moment, he gets a call from Jay asking him to note down his secretary's number so they may speak the following day. Chris needs to commit the numbers to memory and visit a neighboring store to write them down because there isn't a pen and paper available. Chris confronts Linda the next day after she drops his son off at daycare. Chris lets Linda go after she tells him she's not happy anymore, but he won't let her take their son with her. Chris takes his son home later that day. Chris begs the landlord to let him remain a little longer so he can pay when he comes to get the rent that evening. Chris offers to paint their rooms himself, and the landlord agrees to let him stay for 10 more days. A knock on the door the following day when Chris is painting the walls white. Chris opens it and sees 2 police officers who inform him he has to accompany them to the station. Chris pays the police station for the parking penalty, but the officer informs him that it will be checked at 9:30 in the morning. Chris is forced to give Linda a call in order to have Linda watch their son while he is away for the day. Linda agrees, but only if she promises to return their son later than expected. Chris spends the night at the station as a result. Chris races to the Dean Witter interview the next day. He doesn't have time to change, so he arrives there still dressed from the previous day. The panelists welcome Chris with obvious displeasure when he arrives for the interview. He reveals rather frankly and without sugarcoating that he had been arrested the previous day on unpaid parking fines. The panel, especially Mr. Frum, The panel's head seems displeased with Chris's informal appearance and manner as the interview goes on. Chris is able to bring humor into the issue despite the stressful setting, which ultimately leads to the panel laughing. Chris feels relieved as the tone gradually changes due to this humorous event. Following the interview, Chris's friend Jay congratulates him on making it through the process without donning the appropriate work clothing. Chris is still dubious about the offer though, especially now that he knows there would be an unpaid internship component to the role. Jay urges Chris to take a gamble and press on despite his doubts. Chris heads back home after the interview to await his wife Linda and their son Christopher. Later on in the evening, Linda shows up accompanied by their kid. That evening, Linda and Chris have a challenging talk while Christopher is sleeping. She tells him that she has found work as a waitress in New York and that she intends to relocate there. Chris hears her out and, despite her obvious distress, accepts her choice as long as their son stays with him. With tears in her eyes, Linda consents to entrust their kid to Chris, realizing how much he loves and trusts him to take care of Christopher. With the assistance of Chris's friend, Chris and Christopher go to a nearby motel the following morning in an attempt to acclimate to life without Linda. Chris chooses to take his son to play basketball in order to spend some quality time with him because it's a Saturday. Young Christopher tells them about his aspiration to play professional basketball one day as they're playing. Beset by the hard facts of life, Chris tells his kid to be more realistic rather than cheering him on right away. He advises Christopher to give up on his unrealistic goals and that his prospects of succeeding in professional sports are low. Chris realizes right once how deeply his remarks have touched his kid and sees the disappointment on his face. Chris pauses to consider his position and swiftly modifies his message. He advises Christopher not to let anyone, not even his own father, to make him believe he is incapable of achieving his goals. Chris teaches his son a valuable lesson about tenacity and self-belief by encouraging him to dream big and follow his dreams. The hospital accepts their medical device when they go there to sell it, giving the father and son at least a little cash to get by. Chris starts his internship the next day to gain knowledge of the trade. Chris runs into Mr. Frum on the street during his lunch break and says hello, but Chris finds the device he left behind during his previous escape from the taxi driver, so their talk is interrupted. Chris follows the guy with the device, but before he can catch up with him, he gets struck by a car. Chris returns to the program with one shoe missing after realizing he lost it while still able to stand. After then, the movie features a number of sequences in which Chris is continuously told what to buy and is directed around. As Chris appears to be having no luck with the names on his checklist in the following scene, he decides to go straight to the CEO of the company in the hopes that something would work. Fortunately, he is given the chance to meet with the CEO. Chris's internship supervisor, Mr. Frakes, regrettably requests him to park his car as he is leaving the premises, which forces him to miss the meeting. That evening, while having dinner at a diner, Chris asks his son to help him out on a trip the following day. It's only after telling his kid that they might go to a football game that he persuades him to come. The next morning, Chris visits Mr. Ribbon, the CEO he had previously called, at his home. Despite missing the opportunity yesterday, he later expresses gratitude to Mr. Ribbon for it. Chris remarks in passing that he and his son, Christopher, are going to the football game, and Mr. Ribbon extends an invitation to them to come. Chris seizes the chance, and the group of them go to the game together. Mr. Ribbon informs Chris during the occasion that, although he is grateful for him, he is unable to accept his business offer. Chris seems to be doing okay, though, as he continues to network and have important conversations with Mr. Ribbon and his business associates in spite of the upsetting news. His optimism, though, is fleeting. Chris finds out one day that money from his bank account has been taken by the IRS to settle his outstanding taxes. He has no money at all after this unexpected setback. Chris is desperate and goes to a friend in an attempt to collect a long overdue loan. Unfortunately, his friend declines to assist, believing the loan to have already been paid off. Chris gets upset and feels even more alone when his pal closes the door on him after they leave him and Christopher off at a motel. Worse, Chris eventually finds the medical equipment he had misplaced earlier that day, but it's just the start of a string of setbacks. After starting to visit other locations in the hopes of selling the medical gadget, Chris and his kid discover that it is malfunctioning. Despite the hospital's assurances that they will cover the cost of the equipment once it is rectified, Chris is already severely stressed out. When they get back to their motel that evening, they discover something even more upsetting. Everything they own has been left outside. Chris tries to open the door, but it's locked, so he and Christopher are left without a place to stay. Chris and his son had to relocate again because they are at a loss on what to do. When they finally arrive at a train station, Christopher says that it's not a time machine after observing the object his father is holding. Chris jokingly asserts that it is in an effort to console his son. He turns on the apparatus, pretending to take them back to the age of dinosaurs, and hits the button. Christopher gladly obliges, and the two enjoy a creative and whimsical moment together. Chris puts his son to bed in the station's restroom as they quickly go there. While sleeping soundly, Christopher discreetly sobs as he confronts one of the lowest times of his life. Chris and his kid try to enter a homeless shelter in the next scenario, but are turned away since they are only permitted to be women and children. After that, they proceed to another homeless shelter where they nearly run out of room due to its already full occupancy. Luckily, after the security person finds out that the person in front of them cheated in line, they are given their own room. Chris tries to mend the equipment within the homeless shelter. In another scene, Chris describes how he and his son have to get in line early at the homeless shelter. so he learns how to wrap up his interactions with clients. The action then cuts to Chris studying for his internship exam tomorrow while he and his son attend mass inside the homeless shelter. The next day, Chris completes his exam with ease. Mr. Frome, fresh out of a cab, asks Chris to give him a loan as he leaves. Even though Chris is short on funds, he still gives him a $5 loan. Chris gives blood in order to get money. He then purchases a component of the item he is repairing with the money. Christopher asks his father in the homeless shelter if he's the reason his mother left them. He is reassured by Chris that her abandoning them is not his fault. Chris is able to fix the device after hearing from his son that he is a good father. He sells the gadget the next day, giving them just enough cash to stay in a motel. The father and kid then head to the beach to escape the harsh environment of the city. The next scene takes place in the restroom, where Jay congratulates Chris on earning a large number of clients on his last day. Subsequently, Mr. Frakes calls Chris and directs him to Mr. Frome, who observes that Chris has on a new shirt. When Chris explains that it's because this is his last day as an intern, Mr. Frome replies that he could wear it tomorrow to let him know that he was hired on as a full-time employee. Fighting back tears, Chris thanks the panel and Mr. Frome gives back the $5 he took from him. After that, Chris exits the building and describes this phase of his life as happiness. After that, he goes straight to his son's daycare and gives him a strong hug. It is revealed in the movie that Chris succeeds in starting his investing company. The actual Chris Gardner then walks by Chris and his son as they stroll and joke around at the end of the movie. According to the epilogue, Chris has closed a contract worth millions of dollars. If so, please remember to subscribe, like, and share it in order to see more fantastic movie recaps. I appreciate you watching.